February 8, 1942 dawned with a brutality that would define the next 100 days of hell. The temperature plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius as Soviet forces slammed shut the steel jaws of their encirclement around 96,000 German soldiers near the town of Demyansk in northwestern Russia. What began as a confident Wehrmacht advance had transformed overnight into a desperate struggle for survival, trapping men from the 16th Army and elements of the Waffen SS in a pocket measuring roughly 40 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep. General Walter von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt, commander of the 2nd Corps, stood in his makeshift headquarters, studying maps that now represented not territorial gains, but the boundaries of a vast prison. The smoking ruins of Demyansk lay at the center of this pocket, surrounded by frozen forests and endless snowfields that stretched toward a horizon offering no hope of rescue. His forces included the 12th Infantry Division, the 30th Infantry Division, the 32nd Infantry Division, and the SS Totenkopf Division, along with supporting units that had been cut off during the Soviet winter offensive. The encirclement had not happened suddenly, but had been building since mid-January when Soviet forces under Marshal Semyon Timoshenko launched Operation Barrier. The 1st Shock Army and the 11th Army had driven deep wedges into German positions, exploiting weaknesses created by the brutal winter and overstretched supply lines. According to records preserved in the German Federal Military Archives, the Soviet objective was clear: destroy Army Group North's southern flank and create a catastrophic defeat that might rival Stalingrad, which was still a year away from its infamous conclusion. Inside the pocket, the reality confronting the trapped soldiers defied comprehension. Supply depots that had seemed adequate weeks earlier now appeared pitifully inadequate. Food rations were cut immediately. Ammunition stocks were inventoried with growing alarm. Medical supplies for treating frostbite, the silent killer claiming more victims than Soviet bullets, were dangerously low. The wounded filled every available building, their moans creating a symphony of suffering that haunted those still capable of fighting. Oberfuhrer Theodor Eicke, commander of the SS Totenkopf Division, gathered his officers in a frozen bunker where their breath crystallized in clouds before their faces. His division, battle-hardened and ideologically fanatical, would anchor the defense of the southern perimeter. Eicke was a brutal man who had previously commanded concentration camps, and he brought that same ruthless efficiency to military operations. His eyes, cold as the Russian winter surrounding them, surveyed his subordinates. "We hold," he said simply. "There is no retreat, no surrender. The Führer will not abandon us." But the soldiers huddled in their frozen positions knew something their commanders seemed reluctant to acknowledge. They were now pawns in a larger game. Hitler, thousands of kilometers away in his headquarters, had already issued his now familiar order: no retreat, hold at all costs. This directive, which would be repeated with disastrous consequences throughout the Eastern Front, transformed the Demyansk pocket into a test case for a strategy of static defense that defied military logic, but reflected the Nazi regime's ideological rigidity. February 16, 1942, marked the beginning of an unprecedented logistical operation that would either save 96,000 men or watch them slowly starve and freeze. General Oberst Ernst Udet's successor at the Luftwaffe Supply Command, General Major Hans-Georg von Seidel, received orders directly from Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself. Establish an air bridge to supply the Demyansk pocket. Göring, still basking in undeserved confidence despite operational failures elsewhere, promised Hitler that his Luftwaffe could sustain the trapped forces indefinitely. The airlift operation centered on the snow-covered airfield at Demyansk itself, a strip of frozen ground that had to be constantly cleared of snow by exhausted soldiers wielding shovels with frozen hands. The Luftwaffe committed Junkers 52 transport aircraft, the workhorse trimotors that had already proven themselves in combat drops and supply missions, but never on this scale or under these conditions. Flight crews faced a gauntlet of Soviet anti-aircraft fire, fighter interceptions, and weather conditions that grounded aircraft more effectively than enemy action. Hauptmann Fritz Morzig, who coordinated the airlift operations according to accounts later published in military histories, calculated that the pocket required a minimum of 300 tons of supplies daily: ammunition, food, medical supplies, fuel, and winter clothing. Each Junkers 52 could carry approximately 2 tons when fully loaded, meaning 150 sorties daily would be needed just to maintain minimum survival levels. But the Luftwaffe, already overstretched across multiple fronts, could not consistently provide even half that number of aircraft. The first supply drops created scenes of desperate chaos. Soldiers who had been subsisting on quarter rations for days rushed toward the landing aircraft, some weeping openly at the sight of food containers being unloaded onto the snow. But the celebrations proved premature. The arriving supplies, while psychologically vital, fell far short of actual needs. Frostbite cases continued to overwhelm medical stations. Ammunition had to be rationed so severely that soldiers were ordered to hold fire unless enemy infantry approached within 100 meters. Major Klaus von Schirach, operations officer for the 12th Infantry Division, maintained a diary that survived the war and is now housed in the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich. His entries from late February paint a grim picture. February 23rd. 3 aircraft arrived today. 1 crashed on landing, killing the crew and destroying most of its cargo. The men watched the sky constantly, as though their collective will might summon more planes. They no longer speak of relief columns or counterattacks. They speak only of survival until the next supply drop. Soviet forces, recognizing the critical importance of the airlift, intensified efforts to disrupt it. Yakovlev Yak-1 fighters and Lavochkin Lay GG-3 interceptors prowled the air corridors, hunting for the lumbering transports. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pocket, creating deadly flak zones that pilots had to navigate twice per mission. Soviet ski troops infiltrated close to the airfield, attempting to strike aircraft on the ground or during the vulnerable moments of takeoff and landing. Despite these dangers, the Luftwaffe crews persisted with remarkable courage. They flew through blizzards that reduced visibility to 0, navigated by dead reckoning when instruments froze, and landed on runways pockmarked with shell craters. Some pilots completed 3 or 4 missions daily, flying until exhaustion made them dangerous to themselves and their crews. March 3, 1942, brought a Soviet offensive that threatened to crush the pocket entirely. Marshal Timoshenko, sensing that the trapped Germans were weakening, committed fresh divisions to reduce the Demyansk salient before spring thaw made offensive operations impossible. The 11th Soviet Army, reinforced with Siberian units accustomed to winter warfare, struck at the northern perimeter where the 30th Infantry Division held positions along the frozen Lovat River. The attack began at dawn with an artillery barrage that turned the frozen landscape into an eruption of snow, mud, and shattered trees. Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers, which German soldiers had nicknamed Stalin's organs for their distinctive howling sound, added their terrifying chorus to the conventional artillery. Then came the infantry, waves of Soviet soldiers in white camouflage suits emerging from the tree line like ghosts materializing from the snow itself. Oberst Heinrich Valor, commanding the 30th Division's forward regiments, watched through binoculars as the Soviet assault developed. His defensive positions, meticulously prepared over weeks, consisted of frozen earth bunkers, machine gun nests positioned for interlocking fields of fire, and obstacles improvised from whatever materials could be found. But the relentless cold had degraded everything. Machine guns frequently jammed from frozen mechanisms. Rifles had to be kept inside soldiers' coats to prevent the bolts from freezing solid. Artillery pieces required fires to be lit beneath them before they could be operated. The fighting devolved into brutal close-quarters combat. Soviet troops reached the German trenches despite devastating defensive fire, and men fought with knives, entrenching tools, and bare hands in frozen holes where the dead from both sides accumulated like cordwood. A Soviet lieutenant named Pavel Rubanov, whose account appears in Russian military archives referenced by historian David Glantz, wrote that his men were ordered to crush the fascist pocket regardless of losses, and that commissars shot anyone who retreated without orders. For 3 days the battle raged along a 5-kilometer front. The 30th Division bent but did not break, though casualties mounted alarmingly. Company after company was reduced to skeleton strength. Battalion commanders found themselves leading groups of 50 or 60 men that had once numbered 800. The wounded were dragged to collection points where they lay on the frozen ground, many dying before they could be evacuated to the already overwhelmed hospitals in Demyansk. Theodor Eicke's SS Totenkopf division was rushed north to plug gaps in the line. The SS troops, better equipped and supplied than regular army units, counterattacked with characteristic ferocity. Eicke personally led elements of his division in a nighttime assault that recaptured a key hill position, restoring the defensive perimeter. But even the elite SS units were suffering. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat losses. The division's combat strength had fallen to barely 60% of its authorized level. Inside the pocket, a grim routine established itself. Soldiers learned to exist on 400 grams of bread per day, supplemented occasionally with horse meat from animals killed by artillery fire or simple starvation. They learned to sleep in shifts in dugouts where the temperature never rose above freezing. They learned to recognize the sound of approaching aircraft and distinguish between friendly Junkers and Soviet bombers. Most importantly, they learned to suppress hope, for hope was more dangerous than despair in a place where each day might be your last. March 20th, 1942 witnessed the beginning of Operation Fall Reap, the German attempt to smash through Soviet lines and relieve the Demyansk pocket from the outside. General der Infanterie, Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, assembled a relief force built around the 5th Light Division and elements of the 8th Panzer Division near the town of Staraya Russa, approximately 80 kilometers northwest of the encircled forces. The plan called for a direct thrust along the narrow corridor between Lake Ilmen and the Lovat River, punching through Soviet positions to establish a land corridor. The relief force faced daunting obstacles from the outset. The spring thaw had begun early, transforming roads into rivers of mud that could swallow trucks whole and reduce tank movement to a crawl. The Soviet 34th Army held fortified positions directly in the path of the German advance, and Soviet commanders, recognizing the threat, rushed reinforcements to strengthen these defenses. Nevertheless, Hitler demanded immediate action, and von Seydlitz-Kurzbach obeyed despite his private reservations. The attack commenced at 0600 hours with a concentrated artillery bombardment, followed by an armored assault. Panzer Mark III and Mark IV tanks, their treads churning through mud and snow, led the advance while grenadiers followed in their wake. Initial progress seemed promising as German forces broke through the first line of Soviet defenses, capturing several villages and advancing nearly 10 kilometers on the first day. Inside the pocket, radio operators relayed news of the relief column's progress, sparking cautious optimism among the trapped soldiers. But Soviet resistance stiffened dramatically on the second day. Anti-tank guns, expertly camouflaged in the mixed terrain of forests and frozen marshland, destroyed a dozen panzers before the Germans could locate and eliminate them. Soviet infantry, supported by T-34 tanks, launched counterattacks that forced the Germans to fight for every meter of ground. The advance slowed to a bloody crawl, measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers, and casualties mounted on both sides with horrifying speed. Lieutenant Werner Haupt, a company commander in the 5th Light Division whose memoirs were later published as Army Group North, described the relief attempt as advancing through a landscape of death. We passed through villages where every structure had been reduced to charred timbers and broken stone. The fields were littered with frozen corpses from earlier fighting, German and Russian alike, preserved by the cold like grotesque statues. Our own losses grew heavier with each kilometer. My company, which had begun the offensive with 130 men, was down to 73 by the 4th day. Inside the Demyansk pocket, soldiers followed the relief column's progress with an intensity bordering on obsession. Radio operators constantly updated maps showing the shrinking distance between the two forces. Commanders calculated how long supplies could last if the relief column maintained its current pace. But days turned into weeks, and the expected breakthrough never came. The relief force, itself now fighting for survival, had advanced barely 30 kilometers and was bogging down completely as the spring thaw intensified. The situation reached crisis point on April 2nd, when Soviet forces counterattacked against both the relief column and the northern edge of the pocket simultaneously, threatening to turn the relief operation into a second encirclement. Von Seydlitz-Kurzbach was forced to commit his reserves just to maintain the positions already gained, abandoning further offensive operations until conditions improved. For the men trapped in Demyansk, this meant continued dependence on the airlift and continued erosion of their combat capability. April 15, 1942 found the Demyansk pocket transformed into a vast open-air hospital, where survival itself constituted victory. Medical facilities operated in conditions that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. Oberarzt Heinrich Bergmann, chief medical officer for the Second Corps, supervised a network of aid stations, field hospitals, and casualty collection points that struggled to treat thousands of wounded and sick soldiers with supplies sufficient for hundreds. According to documentation preserved in the German Medical History Association archives, frostbite cases alone exceeded 12,000, with hundreds requiring amputations performed under primitive conditions. The wounded occupied every available structure within the pocket. Schools, churches, barns, and even outdoor trenches served as overflow facilities when the designated hospitals filled beyond capacity. Soldiers with severe frostbite lay beside those with gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries, all waiting for treatment from medical staff, who worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. Anesthesia supplies had run critically low by mid-March, forcing surgeons to perform amputations with only vodka or schnapps to dull the patient's agony. The screams of men undergoing surgery without adequate pain relief became another constant feature of life in the pocket. Feldwebel Otto Kruger, a medical orderly whose letters home were later published in a collection titled Letters from the Eastern Front, provided harrowing details. We have men whose feet have frozen solid inside their boots. When we remove the boots, the flesh comes away with them. Many beg us to let them die rather than face life as cripples. Yesterday I helped amputate a young soldier's legs. He was 19 years old from Munich, and he sang a children's song while the doctor sawed through his bones. The morphine had run out 3 days ago. Food scarcity created its own medical crisis. Malnutrition weakened soldiers' immune systems, making them vulnerable to typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections that spread rapidly through crowded bunkers. The daily ration, which had started at 400 grams of bread, dropped to 300 grams by mid-April. Horse meat, once considered a supplement, became the primary protein source. When the horses were exhausted, soldiers ate whatever they could find: tree bark, leather belts boiled into soup, and eventually dogs and cats that had somehow survived within the pocket. The Luftwaffe airlift, while preventing complete starvation, remained woefully inadequate. Statistics compiled by Luftwaffe logistics officers show that during April, aircraft delivered an average of only 170 tons of supplies daily, well below the 300 tons required. This shortfall meant constant choices between competing necessities: ammunition or food, medical supplies or fuel, winter clothing or replacement weapons. Battalion commanders found themselves making decisions about which men would eat and which would go hungry, which wounded would receive evacuation priority, and which would remain to take their chances in the pocket's overwhelmed hospitals. Morale, surprisingly, remained relatively intact despite the horrific conditions. This resilience stemmed partly from Nazi propaganda that emphasized heroic last stands, and partly from soldiers' bonds with their comrades. Men who might have surrendered individually instead chose to endure for the sake of their units. Letters and diaries from this period, collected by various historical institutes, reveal soldiers who maintained dark humor and small rituals of normalcy, even in the depths of suffering. They celebrated Easter with makeshift services, shared tobacco when the rare cigarette became available, and found comfort in remembering peacetime lives that seemed impossibly distant. But beneath the surface endurance, psychological casualties mounted as surely as physical ones. Soldiers who had witnessed too much death, endured too much cold, and suffered too much hunger began breaking under the strain. Some became catatonic, staring at nothing for hours. Others became reckless, taking suicidal risks during combat as though seeking death. Cases of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder were handled crudely, if at all, usually by returning the soldier to duty or, In severe cases, evacuating them on the precious aircraft that many believed should have been reserved for the physically wounded. April 21, 1942, brought the breakthrough that 96,000 trapped soldiers had awaited for 73 days of frozen hell. General von Seydlitz's Kurzbach's relief force, reinforced and reorganized after the setbacks of March, launched a renewed offensive that finally punched through Soviet lines. The 12th Panzer Division, rushed from France specifically for this operation, spearheaded the assault alongside elements of the 8th Jaeger Division, advancing through the muddy forest south of Staraya Russa toward the northwestern edge of the pocket. The final push required 5 days of brutal fighting. Soviet forces, recognizing that failure to stop the relief column would waste 3 months of encirclement efforts, defended every forest path and stream crossing with desperate intensity. Anti-tank ditches, minefields, and log bunkers turned the narrow advance corridor into a gauntlet of death. German combat engineers worked under fire to clear obstacles while infantry and armor pushed forward meter by bloody meter. The 12th Panzer Division alone lost 47 tanks during this 5-day period, according to unit records housed in the Federal Archive. Inside the pocket, advance units of the 30th Infantry Division prepared for their own breakout attempt to link up with the approaching relief force. On April 24th, as reconnaissance patrols reported German armor less than 2 kilometers away, assault companies moved forward through their own defensive perimeter into the no-man's land that separated the two forces. Artillery from both the relief column and the encircled troops pounded Soviet positions, creating a thunderous barrage that could be heard across the entire salient. Oberleutnant Friedrich Vollbrecht, commanding a company from the 30th Division, led his men through frozen marsh and scattered woodland toward the sound of tank engines. His account, preserved in the division's war diary, captures the moment. "We moved cautiously at first, expecting Soviet resistance, but found only abandoned positions and scattered equipment. Then we saw them, our comrades from the outside, their tanks emerging from the tree line like steel angels. Men on both sides began shouting, some laughing, some weeping. We had endured 73 days of isolation, and now we were no longer alone." The land corridor, when finally established, measured barely 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, a tenuous thread connecting the pocket to German-held territory. Soviet forces still controlled the terrain on both sides, subjecting the corridor to constant artillery fire and infantry probes. Supply convoys moving through what soldiers nicknamed the Demyansk Ditch, or the Death Corridor, required armored escorts and often sustained casualties from Soviet attacks. Nevertheless, the corridor allowed a flood of desperately needed supplies to reach the pocket, and, equally important, permitted evacuation of the most severely wounded. The first major supply convoy to reach Demyansk via the land corridor arrived on April 27th, bringing trucks loaded with food, ammunition, medical supplies, and mail from home. The arrival of letters, some dated months earlier, provided a psychological boost that rivaled the material supplies. Soldiers who had felt abandoned by the outside world now held tangible proof that they had not been forgotten. Feldpost, the military mail system, resumed operation, allowing the trapped troops to send letters to their families for the first time since mid-February. However, the opening of the corridor did not end the crisis or transform the pocket into a secure position. German forces still occupied a vulnerable salient deep in Soviet-held territory, requiring constant defensive effort and consuming resources far beyond the position's strategic value. The corridor itself remained under constant threat, with Soviet forces launching repeated attempts to cut it again throughout May. The relief of Demyansk had succeeded, but at enormous cost and with questionable strategic benefit. Facts that would become clearer in the months ahead. May 10, 1942 marked the official end of the Demyansk pocket crisis as German engineers widened the corridor and established more permanent defensive lines. But the reckoning of what the pocket had cost had only begun. Casualty reports compiled by the Second Corps staff painted a devastating picture. Of the 96,000 soldiers originally trapped, over 3,000 had been killed in action, nearly 13,000 wounded severely enough to require evacuation, and more than 10,000 suffered from severe frostbite with lasting disabilities. These figures, referenced in military historian Robert Kerschubel's work. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of Soviet Russia, represented losses that the Wehrmacht could ill afford on an eastern front that consumed divisions like fuel. The Luftwaffe's role in the Demyansk airlift had been trumpeted by Nazi propaganda as proof that encircled forces could be sustained indefinitely by air supply. Reichsmarshal Göring personally claimed credit for the operation's success, presenting it to Hitler as a model for future operations. This dangerous lesson would contribute directly to decisions made later that year at Stalingrad, where similar promises of air supply would prove catastrophically false. The Demyansk airlift had succeeded, but only barely, and under conditions more favorable than those that would exist at Stalingrad. A smaller pocket, closer to German airfields, and without the massive Soviet air superiority that would dominate later battles. The human cost extended beyond simple casualty statistics. Thousands of soldiers evacuated from the pocket carried physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. Military hospitals across Germany filled with men missing fingers, toes, hands, or feet to frostbite. Others bore wounds that had become infected during the weeks-long wait for proper medical treatment, requiring multiple surgeries and extended recovery periods. The psychological casualties, less visible but equally debilitating, manifested in nightmares, depression, and what doctors called front neurose, or combat neurosis, conditions the Wehrmacht medical establishment poorly understood and inadequately treated. Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, an administrative officer who compiled casualty reports for Army Group North, wrote in his official assessment that the Demyansk operation demonstrated both the resilience of German soldiers and the unsustainability of Hitler's no-retreat doctrine. We saved 96,000 men, but at the cost of creating a salient that absorbed resources desperately needed elsewhere. The relief operation alone consumed 2 panzer divisions, countless supply convoys and Luftwaffe assets that could have supported operations across the entire northern sector. The Soviet perspective on Demyansk revealed a parallel calculus of costs and benefits. Soviet forces had invested 3 months and substantial manpower attempting to reduce the pocket, diverting resources from other operations. The failure to destroy the encircled Germans represented a setback for Soviet offensive plans and demonstrated continuing Wehrmacht resilience. However, Soviet commanders drew valuable lessons about encirclement operations, winter warfare, and the importance of cutting supply lines, lessons they would apply with devastating effect later in the war. Marshal Timoshenko's after-action reports, partially declassified in Russian archives, acknowledged tactical failures while noting that the operation had severely weakened German forces in the northern sector. For the surviving soldiers of the Demyansk pocket, the end of their ordeal brought not triumph but exhaustion and grim knowledge of mortality. They had endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance and survived, but the experience had changed them fundamentally. Letters written after the corridor opened reveal men who had lost comrades, witnessed horrors, and confronted their own mortality in ways that could never be fully communicated to those who had not shared the experience. They formed a brotherhood forged in suffering, bound by memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The German military awarded numerous decorations for the Demyansk operation, including Knight's Crosses to commanders whose leadership kept the pocket from collapsing. Soldiers who had endured the entire encirclement received the special Demyansk Shield, a metal badge worn on the left sleeve that marked them as survivors of one of the Eastern Front's most grueling ordeals. But no medal could adequately recognize what they had endured or compensate for what they had lost in those 73 days of isolation. June 1, 1942, found German military planners grappling with the strategic implications of the Demyansk operation as preparations began for the summer offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. The successful relief of the pocket had preserved nearly 96,000 soldiers, but at costs that raised fundamental questions about Hitler's insistence on holding every position regardless of strategic value. The resources consumed by maintaining and relieving Demyansk, including 2 panzer divisions, extensive Luftwaffe assets, and countless supply convoys, represented material that could have supported offensive operations elsewhere along the sprawling Eastern Front. General Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, maintained a diary throughout the war that provides insight into high-level strategic thinking. His entries from this period, later published and referenced by historians including David Stahl, reveal growing concern about Hitler's operational decision-making. Halder noted that the Führer had drawn exactly the wrong lesson from Demyansk, believing that air supply could sustain encircled forces indefinitely, and that retreat was never necessary if soldiers simply held their positions with sufficient determination. This mindset would prove disastrous later that year. The Demyansk salient itself remained a problematic position throughout the summer of 1942. German forces controlled the territory but at constant cost in manpower and supplies. Soviet forces continued applying pressure, launching local attacks to probe German defenses and prevent reinforcements from being withdrawn for service elsewhere. The salient had become a suppurating wound that drained resources without providing corresponding strategic benefits. But Hitler's prestige had become invested in holding it, making withdrawal politically difficult regardless of military logic. Soviet military analysts conducted extensive reviews of the Demyansk operation, examining both their failures and successes. Reports prepared for the Soviet High Command, some of which have been made available through the Russian State Military Archive, identified several key problems: inadequate coordination between encircling forces, insufficient artillery and air support for infantry assaults, and underestimation of German defensive capabilities. These lessons informed Soviet planning for future encirclement operations, contributing to the development of tactics that would be employed with devastating effectiveness at Stalingrad and later battles. The logistical lessons from Demyansk proved particularly significant. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated that troops could be supplied by airlift for an extended period, but the operation had required nearly ideal conditions: relatively short distances from German airfields, a relatively small pocket, and an enemy air force not yet fully mobilized. When these conditions did not exist, as would be the case at Stalingrad, air supply proved grossly inadequate. Göring's boasts about Luftwaffe capabilities created expectations that could not be met, setting the stage for one of the war's greatest disasters. The propaganda value of Demyansk was exploited extensively by both sides. German propaganda portrayed the pocket's survival as testament to German soldiers' superiority and will to victory. Newsreels showed supplies being delivered by air and relief columns breaking through to cheering troops, omitting the suffering, casualties, and near disaster that characterized the actual operation. Soviet propaganda, conversely, emphasized the heavy casualties inflicted on German forces and portrayed the encirclement as evidence of the Red Army's growing capability, downplaying the failure to destroy the pocket completely. For soldiers throughout the Wehrmacht, Demyansk became a reference point and cautionary tale. Those who had survived it carried a certain mystique, marked by their Demyansk shields and their haunted eyes. Others looked at the pocket survivors and wondered whether they could endure similar ordeals if circumstances required. The experience demonstrated both the remarkable resilience of German soldiers and the terrible price of Hitler's rigid defensive doctrine, lessons that would be tested repeatedly as the war continued and Soviet capabilities grew stronger, while German resources diminished. July 20th, 1942 found survivors of the Demyansk pocket scattered across different units, carrying their memories and scars to new battles. Among them was Feldwebel Hans Schmidt of the 30th Infantry Division, who had entered the pocket as a robust 24-year-old and emerged 73 days later having lost 3 toes to frostbite and 15 kilograms from his already lean frame. His letters home to his wife Greta in Hamburg, preserved by his family and later donated to the German Historical Museum, provide intimate glimpses into how individual soldiers processed their trauma. Schmidt wrote on July 23rd, "I still dream of the cold every night even though we are in summer and the temperature is warm. In my dreams I am back in that frozen hole, listening to the wounded cry for help that never comes, watching the sky for aircraft that might not arrive. I wake sweating and afraid, and it takes several minutes to remember that I am safe, that the pocket is behind me. But is it really? Can such things ever truly be left behind?" Another survivor, Obergefreiter Wilhelm Becker of the SS Totenkopf Division, took a different path through his trauma. Becker, a committed Nazi before the war, emerged from Demyansk with his ideological certainty shattered. His diary entries, confiscated by American forces in 1945, and now housed in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum archive, document a gradual disillusionment. We were told we were supermen fighting for a glorious cause. But in that frozen hell there were no supermen, only starving, frightened boys far from home. The Führer's promises that we would be rescued sounded increasingly hollow as we ate horsemeat and counted our dwindling ammunition. Medical personnel who served in the pocket carried their own burdens. Sanitätsunteroffizier Paul Weber had performed medical duties throughout the encirclement, witnessing suffering that would have broken many men. His post-war testimony, given to researchers studying combat trauma, revealed the psychological cost. I became numb to suffering because I had to. If I had allowed myself to feel the full weight of each wounded man's pain, I would have been unable to function. So I built walls around my emotions, and those walls remained long after the war ended. My family says I became cold, distant. Perhaps I did. Perhaps that was the price of surviving. The experience of being trapped in Demyansk created bonds between survivors that transcended normal military camaraderie. After the war, veterans of the pocket formed associations that held annual reunions, not to celebrate their experience, but to be with others who understood what they had endured. These gatherings, documented by German sociologists studying war veterans, provided spaces where men could discuss memories and nightmares that civilian families could not comprehend. Lieutenant Karl Richter, who had commanded a company in the 12th Infantry Division, found purpose after the war by documenting the pocket's history. His extensively researched book, 73 Days, The Demyansk Pocket 1942, published in 1958, combined official records with personal testimonies to create a comprehensive account. In the introduction, Richter wrote, "I undertook this project not to glorify what we endured, but to ensure that those who died in that frozen pocket would not be forgotten, and that future generations might learn from this example of how ideology and rigid thinking can create unnecessary suffering." Not all survivors successfully reintegrated into post-war life. Some, unable to process their trauma, succumbed to alcoholism, depression, or suicide in the years following the war. Others carried physical disabilities from frostbite amputations that limited their employment opportunities and required lifelong medical care. The German government's compensation system for disabled veterans, though better than in many countries, could not fully address the complex needs of men whose injuries were both physical and psychological. For Soviet soldiers who fought around the Demyansk pocket, the experience was equally formative. Red Army veteran Dmitry Petrov, interviewed in the 1980s for an oral history project, recalled, "We threw everything we had at that pocket, and still the Germans held. We learned to respect our enemy even as we hated them. They were tough, well-trained, and led by capable officers. Our own forces improved because we had to, because fighting such an enemy demanded we become better soldiers ourselves." January 8, 1943 witnessed the final German withdrawal from the Demyansk salient, nearly a year after the pocket's initial encirclement. Hitler had finally authorized the evacuation of the position after recognizing that the resources required to maintain it could not be justified. The withdrawal, carefully planned and executed over several weeks, proceeded without the catastrophic Soviet interference that might have been expected, as Soviet forces were by then focused on the larger drama unfolding at Stalingrad, where another German army faced encirclement under far worse conditions. The contrast between Demyansk and Stalingrad could not have been more stark or instructive. At Demyansk, 96,000 men had been encircled in winter and sustained by airlift for 73 days before being relieved, suffering heavy casualties, but avoiding complete destruction. At Stalingrad, approximately 290,000 German and Axis soldiers were encircled in similar winter conditions. Göring made similar promises about air supply, but this time, the promises proved empty. The Sixth Army at Stalingrad was not relieved, was not sustained, and was eventually destroyed completely, with only about 6,000 survivors eventually returning from Soviet captivity. Military historians have extensively debated why Hitler learned the wrong lessons from Demyansk. Jeffrey Megargy's research, published in Inside Hitler's High Command, argues that the Führer's ideological rigidity prevented him from understanding that Demyansk succeeded despite his no-retreat orders, not because of them. The pocket survived because of favorable conditions, capable commanders who exercised initiative despite orders, and Soviet weaknesses that would not exist later in the war. Hitler instead interpreted Demyansk as validation of his belief that willpower alone could overcome material disadvantages. The operational lessons from Demyansk influenced military thinking on both sides throughout the remainder of the war. The Germans refined their air supply techniques but never again achieved similar success under comparable conditions. The Soviets perfected their encirclement tactics, learning from their Demyansk failures to create the devastating cauldron battles that would characterize the later Eastern Front. Deep battle doctrine, emphasizing multiple simultaneous encirclements and disruption of enemy supply lines, evolved partly from the Demyansk experience. From a human perspective, the Demyansk pocket represented a microcosm of the Eastern Front's larger tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of men, German and Soviet, killed or maimed for positions of dubious strategic value in service of ideological systems that regarded individual lives as expendable. The frozen forests around Demyansk became graveyards for young men who might otherwise have lived full lives, contributed to their societies, and raised families. The war's human cost is often expressed in abstract millions, but each of those millions was an individual person whose death diminished the world. The physical landscape around Demyansk still bears traces of the battle 70-plus years later. German military cemeteries maintained by the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge hold thousands of soldiers who died in the pocket. Russian villagers occasionally discover artifacts, rusted weapons, frozen boot fragments, scattered bones. Local museums display relics from the battle, educating new generations about the conflict that ravaged their region. But the landscape itself has healed in ways the survivors never fully could. Forests regrowing over trenches and mass graves becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Contemporary analysis of the Demyansk operation appears in numerous military studies and historical works. The United States Army's Command and General Staff College includes Demyansk in coursework, examining defensive operations and logistics under extreme conditions. The battle demonstrates principles that remain relevant: the importance of maintaining supply lines, the limits of air supply for ground forces, the dangers of rigid defensive doctrines, and the extraordinary resilience of well-led soldiers even under terrible conditions. For the survivors who lived into old age, Demyansk remained a defining experience that shaped their understanding of war, leadership, and human nature. Their testimonies, collected over decades by historians and institutions, provide invaluable primary source material for understanding not just the battle's tactical details but its human dimensions. These elderly veterans, interviewed in the 1980s and 90s, spoke with remarkable consistency about certain truths: the bonds formed under extreme stress, the randomness of who survived and who died, and the lasting psychological impact of prolonged trauma. The Demyansk pocket's place in World War II history remains somewhat obscure compared to more famous battles like Stalingrad, Kursk, or the Normandy invasion. Yet for those who study the Eastern Front's brutal dynamics, Demyansk represents a crucial case study in the Wehrmacht's gradual destruction and the Red Army's evolution from battered defender to devastating offensive force. The battle illustrated both German tactical proficiency and strategic foolishness, Soviet determination and operational limitations, and the terrible human cost of ideologically driven warfare. 73 days of frozen hell left scars on thousands of individuals and lessons that echo through military history to the present day.